Her roof wasn't destroyed by a storm or by chance. It was crushed by the very tree she demanded be cut down, the first one she pointed at with that smug little smile. What followed wasn't just an accident. It was a collapse of lies, power, and control, caught on a 911 call where she ended up exposing herself. This is not just karma. It's the kind that makes you question every voice of authority you've ever trusted. And before we start, like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Sirens wailed before anyone could even process the sound of wood breaking. Neighbors stood frozen, watching a roof collapse beneath the weight of a tree that should have stood for decades more. Not just any tree. The very first one Karen ordered to be cut, the one she marked herself with smug certainty, claiming it was dangerous. And in that single moment, the mask of control she wore shattered along with the tiles of her roof. What nobody expected was that her own voice would later betray her on a 911 call, sealing her fate. It all began with letters stuffed in mailboxes, warnings coded in legal threats. Karen's HOA fines weren't suggestions, they were ultimatums. Miss one payment, and you risked a lien on your home. Refuse one demand, and you became the target of whispered rumors and pointed stares at board meetings. She lived for that power, and the day she marched up in a spotless white suit, she had the eyes of the entire neighborhood locked on her. She walked straight to the oldest tree, slapped neon paint across its bark, and smirked. "This one goes first," she said. She didn't ask. She commanded. The contractor hesitated. He knew the wind, he knew the angle, and he knew the cut wasn't right. But a whisper followed him like a blade. If he refused, she'd bury his license in complaints. She leaned in close, her words venom dressed in politeness, promising consequences if her will wasn't followed. And just like that, safety lost to fear, and compliance replaced caution. Every neighbor knew they weren't watching routine yard work. They were watching an execution, ordered by a woman desperate to prove her authority. A fine notice arrived that morning, stamped in red, giving 48 hours before the next penalty hit. Karen waved it in the air, laughing, calling it justice. A teenager stood at the edge of the street, phone raised, streaming live, whispering to his friends that this was going to be good. Bark flew when the chainsaw touched, splinters snapping like gunfire, and the sound spread through the block like a warning no one wanted to hear. The tree groaned as if alive, resisting, bending in defiance, but the cut deepened because Karen stood there nodding, daring anyone to stop her. The retired firefighter neighbor muttered that the wind was wrong, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the saw. You could see the contractor's hands shaking as the hinge would grew thinner than it should ever be. A line was being crossed in real time, and every second that passed built the tension higher. Karen folded her arms, satisfied, already imagining the applause she thought she'd earn for forcing compliance. She didn't see the fear, didn't hear the doubts, didn't care that the rules bent under her control. She believed she owned the ending of this story. But every story has a turn. The wood cracked, loud and sharp, a sound that made stomachs drop. Gasps cut through the silence that followed. The tree shifted, slow at first, then with a violence no one could stop. Every head turned, every heart raced. Karen's smirk slipped as the tree tilted in the wrong direction. Her house stood directly in its path, and no amount of commands, fines, or threats could stop what gravity had already claimed. In that single heartbeat, everyone realized this wasn't compliance. It was karma, delivered instantly, without appeal. The teenager's camera caught it all. The glass shattering, the roof collapsing, the white suit no longer glowing with pride, but frozen in disbelief. Karen stumbled back, hands shaking, phone slipping from her grip as she dialed 911. Her voice cracked, panicked, betraying every ounce of control she once flaunted. And the operator asked the question no one expected. Who demanded this tree be cut first? Her answer came without thought, an instinctive admission that would haunt her. She said her own name. What comes next isn't just fallout, it's revelation. Because once her words were recorded, once the truth left her mouth, there was no walking back. And that 911 tape would not only shatter her roof, but her reputation, her presidency, and every lie she built to keep power in her hands. What happens when authority exposes itself as the villain? You're about to see. The neighborhood thought the crash was the climax, but it was only the opening act. As smoke alarms screamed from the wreckage, Karen's voice cut through the chaos, desperate, blaming anyone but herself. She barked at the contractor, accused him of sabotage, then turned on the neighbors, spitting that they had watched her be targeted for years. Her words weren't pleas. They were weapons, sharp, frantic, wild. And the more she swung them, the more the truth slipped out between her breaths. The contractor's hands trembled, his face pale. He whispered under his breath that he warned her, that he begged her to change the order, that the cut was forced by her threats. No one had to ask what he meant. Everyone remembered the times she dragged local businesses into HOA complaints when they didn't play by her rules. He had no choice. She cornered him. The guilt poured from him in every syllable, and the crowd felt the weight of it. This wasn't an accident. It was a command executed against common sense, and everyone had just seen it. A phone buzzed in the crowd. Karen's text flashed across the screen of a neighbor she thought she could control. The message promised favors at the next board vote if he supported her version of events. He read it out loud, his voice steady but laced with disgust. A hush spread through the block as the evidence landed harder than the tree. Her own words betrayed her in real time, not just on 911, but in the palms of those she thought she owned. Then came the slip of paper under a door. Folded, rushed, written in shaky handwriting. It carried a warning. She had filed a false permit to force the job forward. The city inspector's name scrawled at the top, her signature forged at the bottom. The contractor held it up, shaking, confessing he had been shown that paper days before. He didn't believe it was real, but fear blinded him into silence. And now that fear burned hotter than fire as neighbors realized this wasn't negligence, it was calculated. A stage performance designed to make her look like the hero fixing someone else's danger. The retired firefighter, a man who spent years running into flames others ran from, stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, but the authority in it cut sharper than any scream. He said the wind had been wrong, the notch had been wrong, and the call to start on that tree was wrong. He didn't need to point at Karen. Every head already turned to her. His final words landed like a hammer. This was never about safety. This was about control. Karen laughed, but it wasn't the confident smirk from before. It was the laugh of someone cornered, cracking under the weight of exposure. She shouted that they were all against her, that jealousy fueled their lies. But the more she spoke, the more her empire crumbled. The teen's live stream ticked upward in viewers, comments pouring in, strangers witnessing the downfall as it unfolded. Each word Karen spit only tightened the noose she had woven for herself. In the crowd, the main character clenched his father's old tree tag, pressing the worn metal into his palm like armor. Generations of work, care, and legacy reduced to a stage for her ego. He looked at her not with rage, but with disbelief at how far she was willing to go. And that disbelief was contagious. Neighbors who once stayed silent under the fear of fines began whispering louder, louder, until the silence of years broke into the sound of rebellion. And then came the twist no one expected. A call had been placed earlier that morning to the city arborist, delaying her arrival by hours. The number traced back to the HOA office. The implication hit like a gunshot. Karen hadn't just forced the cut. She had stalled the one person who could have stopped it. This wasn't chance. It was orchestration. Every second of it. If you've ever felt the weight of someone with a smile on their face and a threat behind their eyes, drop a heart right now so I know you're still with me. Because this is no longer about a tree or a roof. This is about a pattern of power, a system unraveling in front of everyone. And as the contractor adjusted the cut the way Karen demanded, the hinge thinner than it should ever be, every breath felt like the last moment before another collapse. The question lingered heavy in the air. When the next fall comes, who will it bury? The moment the tree split, silence gripped the block before chaos returned twice as loud. It didn't fall where Karen promised it would. It didn't land where the contractor prayed it would. It ripped free from the hinge, caught the wind, and smashed directly into her house. Shards of glass flew like daggers. Alarms howled from every corner, and the weight of her own decision came down on her roof with brutal finality. Neighbors gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others just shook their heads. This wasn't an accident. This was karma written in wood and steel. Karen stumbled forward, her hands clawing at her phone. Her perfect composure evaporated in a second. She screamed at the contractor, accused him of sabotage, her words high-pitched, frantic, bouncing off every wall. But the live stream kept rolling, thousands now watching her crumble in real time. No script, no carefully staged performance, just raw panic bleeding out of her mouth. The teenager holding the phone whispered that this was better than television, but even he couldn't hide the shock in his voice. Everyone knew what they were seeing. Power collapsing in public. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers, spitting half-formed sentences into the receiver. Her voice cracked as she tried to spin the story. She claimed she was the victim, that she tried to stop it, that others had forced her hand. But the operator's tone stayed cold and steady, demanding details she couldn't bend. And then the question came, sharp as a knife. Who demanded the first tree be cut? Her reflex betrayed her. Without hesitation, she said her own name. Gasps erupted. She hadn't just admitted it. She confessed it, broadcast it, burned it into a recording that would live forever. The firefighter neighbor rushed to the injured worker, blood dripping down his arm from flying debris. He shouted for cloth, for pressure, for someone to do something useful. And as he worked, he said the words Karen never wanted heard. Unsafe order. Wrong wind. Wrong tree. He didn't scream. He didn't need to. Truth doesn't need volume when it's undeniable. The crowd murmured, voices rising like a wave. Every whispered story about her finally surfacing. Years of fear cracked open in one shared moment, and there was no putting it back. Karen shouted over them, begging, demanding silence, but her words bounced against a wall that no longer existed. The teen held his phone higher, showing the replay, showing her finger pointing at that tree hours earlier, her smirk as the paint bled across the bark. The comments scrolled fast, strangers laughing, strangers furious, strangers calling her out by name. Her empire of fear had turned into a stage of humiliation, and she was center frame, exposed under the harsh light of her own arrogance. And yet, the most crushing blow wasn't from the tree. It came from her own voice, still recorded on the line. The operator asked again for clarity, repeating the question as if to give her one last chance to lie. But panic stripped her bare, and she doubled down, confirming she gave the order. The contractor lowered his eyes, shoulders heavy, knowing his nightmare had just become evidence. Every second dragged heavier than the last, and the crowd knew they weren't just witnesses. They were jurors in a trial playing out on the street. The main character stood still, jaw tight, clutching that old tree tag like it was burning into his hand. Legacy and memory turned into collateral for her ego. He didn't yell, he didn't gloat. He let the silence around him speak. And that silence grew until Karen's own screams were the only sound left, brittle and hollow, echoing through the air. Authority wasn't hers anymore. She had handed it away with one reckless answer. If accountability matters to you, like this video, share it, and subscribe right now, because the story doesn't stop here. What comes next will expose more than just her lies. It will expose the system that let her rise in the first place. And when the city officials arrive, when the police hear the 911 recording, when the truth lands with the weight of evidence, someone isn't just losing a roof. Someone is losing everything. The operator's final words pierced the air. Stay where you are, officers are on the way. Karen froze, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting like a trapped animal. She hadn't just called for help. She had called in the very people who would hold her accountable. And the question that hung in the air, heavier than the fallen tree, was simple. What happens when the police arrive and the first evidence they hear is her own confession? The flashing lights arrived like judgment carved in red and blue. Officers stepped forward, fire crews close behind, and in the middle of them all stood the city arborist with a folder clutched to her chest. Karen tried to rush forward, her words tumbling over each other, desperate to control the narrative. She pointed at the contractor, at the neighbors, even at the teen still live streaming. But her voice had lost its grip. Authority no longer bent when she spoke. The officers listened, stone-faced, while the arborist quietly opened her file. The first words out of the arborist's mouth struck heavier than the collapse itself. That tree was protected, she said. Its removal could only be approved under a hazard finding, and no such hazard had been documented. She turned the folder around, revealing signatures and timestamps. The permit Karen waved before the board was a lie. The date was wrong, the inspection fabricated, the file incomplete. And suddenly, the story wasn't about a roof. It was about forgery. Karen stammered, tried to twist the timeline. But the officer cut her off with a request. Emails, logs, and communications from the HOA office needed to be secured immediately. Neighbors gasped, some whispering, some openly laughing at the unraveling of the untouchable queen who had fined them for flowers planted an inch too close to the curb. For once, Karen was the one facing rules she couldn't bend. The firefighter neighbor stepped forward again, his voice steady, unwavering. He reminded the officers of his years on the line, of what safety looked like, of what reckless power did to good people. He looked directly at Karen and said she gambled with lives to protect her image. The crowd nodded, whispers rising into a chorus of agreement. It wasn't just about this tree. It was about years of pressure, of fear, of neighbors bullied into silence. One collapse revealed 1,000 cracks. The teen raised his phone higher and replayed the moment she painted the tree. Karen's own smirk flashed across the screen, her finger pointing directly at the trunk. The live stream chat exploded, strangers flooding the feed with disbelief and mockery. This wasn't local anymore. It had gone viral, and no boardroom excuse would erase it. The truth was public, permanent, undeniable. The arborist looked down at the tag dangling from the main character's hand, the old piece of metal pressed into his palm. She recognized it instantly, a relic from planting programs decades earlier. She whispered that those trees were anchors, not obstacles, and that they carried more history than anyone in the room wanted to admit. Her words carried weight, the kind of moral gravity Karen couldn't fake. For the first time that day, silence felt like respect, not fear. Karen lashed out, screaming that everyone was conspiring against her. But every face told the same story. They weren't her subjects anymore. They were witnesses, and each second that passed tightened the walls around her. The officers didn't argue. They simply documented, collected, and prepared. Her power was no longer command. It was evidence. And then, as if to twist the knife, the insurance adjuster stepped into the circle, a folder marked denial grounds in his hands. His voice was crisp, professional, merciless. Claims tied to negligence and coercion would not be covered. He read the words slowly, deliberately. The HOA would not be shielded. Karen's empire of fines had just become a debt, with her name written all over it. Neighbors gasped, some whispering that this was the end, others wondering what she would try next. But no one expected her to collapse quietly. She wouldn't bow. She would fight, lie, claw until there was nothing left. The only question now was how much further she would drag everyone down with her. And as the officers flipped through her files, their eyes narrowed at inconsistencies, a chill ran through the crowd. Something bigger was hidden in those papers. Something even Karen hadn't realized she left behind. What secret had she signed her name to that could destroy not just her position, but everything she claimed to protect? The insurance adjuster's voice was still echoing when Karen's composure cracked for good. She lunged at the contractor, screaming that he had betrayed her, that he had set her up. But his response cut sharper than any accusation. He shouted back that she had threatened his business, that she had cornered him with forged permits and empty promises, that she left him with no choice but to follow her order. His confession dropped like a hammer, and the crowd erupted in murmurs that quickly turned to outrage. The woman who fined neighbors for leaving trash cans out an extra hour had just been unmasked as the one who staged her own disaster. The adjuster opened his folder wider, pulling out photographs, timestamps, and receipts. Every page told the same story. Karen had pressured vendors, manipulated paperwork, and falsified claims to keep her image untouchable. He read one line that silenced even the whispers. The policy she used to guarantee herself coverage had a clause. Fraud nullified everything. Her house, her repairs, her claims, they all evaporated the moment she put pen to forged paper. The roof was gone, and now so was her safety net. Neighbors gasped, some openly laughing, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One woman, fined hundreds by Karen for painting her shutters the wrong shade, stepped forward and whispered that justice had finally arrived. But Karen wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone, waving it like a weapon, and threatened lawsuits, threatened exposure, threatened to take every single person down with her. Her voice cracked, her words chaotic, but the fear she once inspired was gone. No one flinched. They only watched, waiting for her next desperate move. The contractor, still trembling, revealed one more truth. A week earlier, she had cornered him with the same demand. Cut the tree, or she would bury his business under fabricated complaints. He had refused then, and she followed through. He showed the letter she sent, accusing him of incompetence and negligence, a letter designed to destroy his reputation. His eyes burned as he admitted he gave in today because he couldn't take another hit. Fear had driven him, but now fear turned to fury. Every neighbor heard his voice rise as he declared he would never be her victim again. The retired firefighter neighbor produced his phone and played a recording. The grainy audio captured Karen at dawn, trespassing, spray painting the tree herself, muttering lines under her breath, rehearsing what she would say when she stood before the board. Her voice was clear, her arrogance undeniable. The recording became a blade cutting the last thread of credibility she had left. People gasped, some covered their mouths, others turned away in shock. It wasn't a mistake. It was a performance, and the whole neighborhood had been her stage. The main character stood still, the old tree tag pressed hard into his palm, leaving marks on his skin. He watched her unravel, every lie collapsing into truth, every threat dissolving into humiliation. But his silence wasn't weakness, it was judgment, a quiet weight that reminded everyone of what was really at stake. These trees weren't just wood. They were memory, history, legacy. She had tried to erase that for power, and in the process, she erased herself. Karen's voice wavered, but she tried one last weapon. She turned to the officers and claimed she had acted for safety, that she was protecting families, that her leadership was misunderstood. But before she could finish, the city arborist's tablet chimed. An email had arrived. The permit she cited, the one she swore justified her actions, didn't exist. The city confirmed no record, no approval, no legitimacy. The crowd gasped again, louder than before. Forgery wasn't suspicion anymore. It was fact. The officers' eyes narrowed, and their pens scratched across their notebooks. Karen froze, her face draining as the weight of those words sank in. For years, she had been the one writing violations, holding power through paper and ink. Now, the very paper she forged would become the evidence that destroyed her. Neighbors leaned closer, hungry for the final blow, waiting to see the queen of fines fall on her own sword. And the question that hung over the crowd was no longer if she would fall, but how far the collapse would reach. Would she lose only her title, or would the walls of her entire empire come crashing down with her? The HOA scrambled to contain the explosion, but nothing could stop the wildfire of truth. An emergency meeting was called, a gathering that looked more like a trial than a discussion. Karen walked in with a face carved in fury, clutching papers as if they could shield her from the storm. The board members sat stiff, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring at the table, unwilling to meet the eyes of the neighbors who filled the room. For the first time, she didn't command silence. She walked into a room already against her. The first neighbor spoke, a trembling voice carrying years of frustration. She told of fines for flowers, harassment over paint colors, and nights crying over threats of liens. Others followed, voices stacking on each other, each story a crack in the image Karen built. The more they spoke, the more her mask peeled away. The crowd wasn't afraid anymore. Their voices were louder than her penalties, heavier than her threats. For once, her clipboard had no power. Every 30 seconds, the tension climbed higher. A board member, long seen as her loyal ally, pulled out his phone and read her text messages aloud. They revealed promises of special treatment, whispered deals, and calculated punishments for anyone who dared oppose her. Gasps filled the room. The betrayal wasn't just toward the neighbors. It was within the board itself. Even her inner circle was fracturing, desperate to escape the collapse before it swallowed them whole. Then the team stood up, phone in hand, and played the 911 transcript. Karen's voice echoed across the room, panicked, unfiltered, admitting she ordered the tree cut. Her own confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Neighbors who once cowered under her glare now laughed. Others shook their heads in disbelief, and some simply stared with tears of relief. The empire of control had fallen in the span of seconds. The live stream of her downfall had already been seen by tens of thousands, and there was no undoing it. The contractor stepped into the center, his voice stronger now, declaring he had been bullied into silence for too long. He signed a statement right there, his pen dragging across paper as he described every threat, every corner she pushed him into. He handed it to the officer standing by, and the sound of the paper sliding into evidence was louder than any gavel strike. Karen screamed that it was a lie, but the room no longer believed her. The balance had shifted, and she was the only one sinking. The officers secured the HOA laptop, the one Karen used to write violations and log fines. Files flickered open, revealing emails sent at dawn, backdated documents, and more forged permits than anyone imagined. One officer muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The evidence wasn't small. It was systemic. The corruption was deeper than a single tree, deeper than a single roof. This was a pattern of power abused, and it was all in writing. The city representative stood, voice steady, declaring the HOA's enforcement powers suspended pending investigation. The words hit like a final strike, and the neighbors erupted in cheers, some clapping, some crying. Years of fear dissolved into relief. For the first time, they weren't prisoners of Karen's rules. They were free. The look on her face wasn't just shock. It was recognition. She had lost. Not just a roof, not just her title, but the fear she used as her weapon. The main character stood in the middle of it all, silent but firm, holding that old tag like a reminder of why the fight mattered. The trees, the homes, the memories, they belonged to the people, not to the tyranny of one woman's ego. When he raised it in the air, the crowd quieted, the symbol of defiance turning into a moment of unity. He didn't need to speak. The gesture alone carried the weight of everything they had endured. If standing against control matters to you, hit subscribe right now so these stories reach every corner where silence still reigns. And tell me in the comments, what would your neighborhood do if power turned into tyranny? Because in this room, the answer was clear. The officer stood again, holding a small device. He said there was one last piece of evidence, something no one had heard yet. The raw 911 audio, unedited, unreleased, with every second of Karen's meltdown preserved. The crowd leaned forward, hearts racing. What had she said when she thought no one would ever hear it again? The room went silent as the officer pressed play. Static filled the air. Then Karen's voice cracked through, raw and unpolished. It wasn't the polished tone she used at meetings or the cold authority she wielded with fines. It was frantic, panicked, dripping with desperation. She told dispatch she had ordered the tree cut to make herself look strong before the next election, that she needed it gone for a show of leadership. Her voice begged the operator to frame it as negligence by the contractor, begged them to record it the right way so she wouldn't look at fault. Every word landed like a stone, each sentence carving her downfall deeper. Neighbors stared wide-eyed, some covering their mouths in shock, others shaking their heads in disbelief. It was one thing to suspect manipulation, another to hear her admit it out loud. She had turned safety into theater, control into spectacle, and in the end, she had called the very people who would unravel her lies. Her own voice was the wrecking ball that smashed through the facade she spent years building. The insurance adjuster closed his folder, the firefighter folded his arms, and the contractor let out a long, shaky breath as if finally freed from years of chains. One by one, the neighbors looked at each other, no longer divided by fear. For the first time, they saw the truth laid bare, and it united them. A woman who thrived on intimidation had been undone by her own arrogance. The irony was almost too sharp to believe. Karen collapsed into a chair, her face drained, her hands limp. There was no fight left, no words strong enough to rewrite what everyone had just heard. The board voted in seconds, unanimous, her title stripped, her powers gone. The officers stepped closer, evidence bag in hand, noting every file, every recording, every confession. The woman who had once been untouchable was now documented, cataloged, and held to the very rules she had twisted against others. But the story didn't end with her defeat. The main character stepped forward, pulling the old tree tag from his pocket. It wasn't just metal, it was memory, heritage, and resistance all in one. He placed it in the arborist's hand and told her it belonged to the program that planted hope, not fear. The arborist promised it would be used to teach, to rebuild, to remind the next generation that trees could hold history stronger than any piece of paper ever could. It wasn't just closure, it was rebirth. The neighbors clapped, some with tears in their eyes, others laughing at the sheer relief of it all. For once, the sound wasn't fear of fines or orders. It was freedom. They weren't just celebrating the fall of Karen. They were celebrating the rise of their own voices. They realized silence had chained them, but truth had broken those chains forever. Karen's mask slipped for the last time. Behind the arrogance was nothing but fear, exhaustion, and the hollow echo of a power she no longer held. She looked smaller, diminished, not the queen of penalties, but just another person facing the weight of her choices. No one cheered her pain, but no one pitied her either. She had written her ending with her own hand. If you made it this far, drop a heart in the comments so I know you stand with quiet courage over loud control. Like this video, share it with someone who has ever dealt with unfair power, and subscribe because the next story may not just entertain you, it might reflect your own fight. Because these battles are everywhere, and together, voices like yours make sure no one fights alone. As the crowd dispersed, the arborist approached with a small sapling, a promise in green. Tomorrow it would be planted, not by order, not by demand, but by choice. And standing together, they would decide where it belonged. The question now wasn't who had the power. The question was simple. What will grow from here?